Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Let's get started. It was one of those rare afternoons when life seemed determined to present itself in its most civilized form. The sun poured its golden light through the tall windows of the Ritz, painting delicate patterns upon the tablecloths and glinting off the polished silverware. My companion, Hercule Poirot, sat across from me, his small, neat figure perfectly upright, his moustaches immaculately waxed, and his expression one of profound concentration. But his focus was not on the bustling tea room, nor on the guests who murmured softly over their cakes and sandwiches. No, Poirot's entire attention was fixed upon his own plate. "Mon cher Hastings," he said, carefully nudging a small scone precisely into place beside his teacup. "Perfection is a matter of the smallest details. Observe, if you will, the symmetry of the cups and saucers. It is as the universe intended. Balanced, orderly, immaculate." I bit into my own scone with less reverence, letting the cream smudge inelegantly at the corner of my mouth. "I don't know how you have the patience, Poirot," I said cheerfully. "It's just tea, after all." Poirot closed his eyes in faint agony. "You do not understand, my friend. The artistry of a fine tea service is no less delicate than the solving of a crime. Both depend upon harmony, upon every element being placed just so." I was about to tease him further when my eye was drawn to a curious figure across the room, a woman alone at a corner table. She wore a dress of deep burgundy, but what drew my attention most was the crimson veil that completely covered her face, a curtain of silk concealing her identity. "Poirot," I whispered, "have a look at that." Poirot adjusted a single fold of his napkin before turning his head, ever so slightly, to follow my gaze. His dark eyes, ever alert, sharpened at once. "Eh bien," he murmured. "It is not every day one takes tea under the silent observation of a spectre in scarlet. Most curious." The woman sat stiffly, her gloved hands resting on the table, her head inclined just enough that the crimson veil obscured any clear sense of her face. Yet there was something about her posture, something oddly deliberate, as though her attention was fixed not on her tea, nor the room at large, but upon us. "Do you think she's looking at us?" I asked, lowering my voice. "Mais oui," Poirot said softly, "and not for idle amusement, mon ami. There is purpose in that gaze." The longer we observed her, the stranger it seemed. Her gloved fingers tapped restlessly against the tabletop. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. A deliberate pattern, though its meaning escaped me. "She's alone," I noted. "Not waiting for anyone, it seems." Poirot's gaze sharpened further. "Alone, perhaps, but not without intention. Hastings, mon cher, you will learn this lesson yet. No detail is meaningless. A woman does not wear a crimson veil without reason." "Fashion, perhaps," I suggested weakly. Poirot gave a short laugh. "No, no. Fashion is capricious but not sinister. This is a woman hiding her face from the world, yet insisting the world take notice all the same." Before I could respond, the woman shifted. She reached into her reticule and summoned a waiter with a small beckon of her hand. A moment later, the waiter approached our table, a sealed envelope resting on his silver tray. "For Monsieur Poirot," the man said. Poirot accepted the envelope with the faintest raise of his eyebrows, while I stared in open astonishment. "How extraordinary!" I exclaimed. "Who on earth would know you were here?" "Ah, Hastings," Poirot said, tapping the envelope lightly against his fingertips. "You persist in underestimating the fame of Hercule Poirot. It is a burden I bear with grace." The envelope was of heavy cream stock, the handwriting delicate but hurried. A woman's hand, I guessed, though the ink blotted in places, as though written in haste. Poirot slid a knife along the seal and withdrew the letter inside. His eyes flickered across the page, his expression shifting from mild amusement to something far sharper. "Well?" I asked impatiently. Poirot read aloud. "Monsieur Poirot, I am in grave danger, though I cannot say how or why in this letter. There is a house without mirrors. You must come at once. Only you can see what others will not. Do not delay, or the truth will be lost with the setting sun." I stared at him. A house without mirrors? What the devil does that mean? Poirot did not answer immediately. His gaze had returned to the veiled woman, but her chair was empty. The crimson veil lay draped across the back of her chair like the shed skin of some bright snake. She was gone. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "Very curious indeed." The waiter, returning to clear her table, confirmed that the lady had paid her bill only moments before, departing in silence through the side entrance. But why leave the veil behind? I wondered aloud. Poirot's fingers brushed the silk lightly. His brow furrowed in thought. "A veil is a symbol, mon ami. It conceals, but it also reveals. When a woman removes her veil, she exposes her true face. And yet..." He lifted the veil and examined it more closely. "This is no ordinary veil. It is old. Older than the woman herself, I think. It carries the faintest scent of violets." He rose suddenly, his napkin folded neatly on his plate. "Come, Hastings. The game, as you say, is afoot." "And where exactly are we going?" "To the house without mirrors." Poirot's eyes gleamed. Where else would Hercule Poirot begin his search for the truth? I took the letter from Poirot's hand, reading it again with a growing sense of bewilderment. "A house without mirrors," I said slowly. "What kind of nonsense is that?" Poirot raised a delicate finger. "Non, mon ami. You see, but you do not observe. It is not nonsense. It is a fact most intriguing. To ban all mirrors from a house, that is not a whim. That is a fear. But fear of what, I asked myself. "Well," I said, trying to sound logical, "some people have odd superstitions. Perhaps Lady Eugenia, or whoever wrote this, is afraid of her reflection." "Possible," Poirot allowed, "but improbable. The fear of mirrors, catoptrophobia, if you wish to impress your acquaintances at dinner, is rare. More often, it is not the mirror itself one fears, but the truth it reveals." The letter's final line gnawed at me. "Only you can see what others will not. Do not delay, or the truth will be lost with the setting sun." "What's all this about sunset?" I asked. "It sounds like the plot of one of those Gothic novels Miss Lemon reads." Poirot smiled. "The setting sun. It is poetic, yes, but also practical. What is visible at sunset that cannot be seen at noon? Shadows grow long, mon ami. What hides in the light becomes clearer in the dusk." He turned the letter over, studying the back of the paper with care. "Ah, regardez. There is a faint scent. Violets, delicate but unmistakable. Perfume?" "Precisely. And not a modern perfume, I think, but something old-fashioned. A fragrance from the past. This, Hastings, is not merely a cry for help. It is an invitation to step into a tragedy long in the making." Before I could ask another question, I glanced back to the corner where the veiled woman had sat. The chair was empty. "She's gone," I exclaimed. "But she was there not a minute ago." Poirot's eyes narrowed, though his expression remained more amused than alarmed. "Naturellement. A woman who arrives like a whisper must vanish like a sigh." The crimson veil lay draped across the chair, abandoned. Poirot rose, picked it up, and held it to the light. "Exquisite craftsmanship," he murmured. "This is no ordinary veil, Hastings. See, the stitching here, hand done, and the fabric itself. Not modern silk, but something older, richer. It is a relic of the past." He folded the veil neatly and tucked it into his coat. "She has left us a clue, mon ami. Or perhaps a challenge." But where could she have gone? I asked, still craning my neck toward the doorway. Poirot's smile was faint and enigmatic. The question, Hastings, is not where, but why. Why appear, only to disappear? Why leave a veil, but not a name? Why summon Poirot if one does not intend to be found? He tapped his temple. There is method in her mystery. And now, mon cher Hastings, there is also purpose for us. To do what? To find the house without mirrors, and to learn what truth the setting sun was meant to reveal. The countryside unfolded before us like a painting, all rolling hills, wind-swept fields, and narrow roads that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Seated opposite me in the hired car, Poirot appeared singularly unimpressed by the beauty of rural England. His attention was entirely devoted to the letter, which he had read no fewer than 5 times since we set off. Mon cher Hastings, he said at last, do you not find it curious that a house should fear its own reflection? I still say it's sheer superstition, I replied. There are plenty of old families with odd ideas. Some refuse to sit 13 at a table, others cover mirrors after a death. It's all part of English country life. Poirot's moustaches quivered. Ah, the English, with their charming eccentricities. But consider, my friend, such customs are like the dust on a bookshelf. They settle over time, layer by layer. But this is deliberate. A house without mirrors, completely. It is not a custom, it is a decision. And decisions, mon ami, are made for reasons. I was about to argue further when the road curved sharply, and Ravenmore House came into view. It stood alone atop a low hill, a dark silhouette against a sky now streaked with pink and gold. The house seemed to crouch rather than stand, its windows narrow and slit-like, its chimneys leaning at odd angles. There was something peculiar about it, something that made me draw my coat a little tighter around me. I say, Poirot, I said. It's got a blasted eerie look, hasn't it? Poirot nodded, but his expression was serene. Mais oui. And such houses, they remember, Hastings. They remember everything. He withdrew the crimson veil from his pocket, smoothing it gently between his fingers. It begins here, Hastings, the unravelling of the veil. And behind the veil, what do we find? A face from the past, or a reflection of the present? Come, let us see. The door was opened by a woman so severe in appearance that I took her for the housekeeper immediately. Her grey hair was scraped into a bun so tight it pulled at her scalp, and her dress was plain to the point of austerity. You are expected, she said without preamble. This way. Inside, the house was as peculiar as its reputation. Every reflective surface had been either removed or covered. No mirrors, no glass picture frames, not even a polished table surface remained. It gave the house a strangely muted air, as if it were muffled from within. Poirot paused at the entrance hall and made a slow turn, taking in every detail. You observe, Hastings? No chance for one to catch even the faintest glimpse of one's own face. Well, that's what we were told, I muttered. Still seems odd to me. Oddness, mon ami, is often a clue that people dismiss. But the human desire to see oneself, to confirm one exists, this is natural, no? To forbid it entirely, that is unnatural. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dorcas Brightwell, led us into a sitting room decorated in faded grandeur, heavy velvet drapes, tarnished silver candlesticks, and furniture that seemed to sag under the weight of memory. Lady Eugenia is... She stopped abruptly, corrected herself. That is to say, you have come too late. Too late? Poirot's brows lifted. Lady Eugenia. She is dead? Mrs. Brightwell's hands twisted at her apron. Last night, she said, almost whispering. They say she took her own life. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And the lady? She left no message? Oh, there was a note, Mrs. Brightwell said reluctantly. And she was found, wearing that veil. The crimson veil, I burst out. But why? Mrs. Brightwell shuddered. This house, sir, It remembers. The mirrors are gone, but memories, they still find a way to reflect. Poirot clasped his hands and murmured softly, "Curious. Very curious indeed." Mrs. Brightwell led us up the wide, creaking staircase, her steps hesitant, as though reluctant to reach the destination. Poirot followed at his usual measured pace, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes flickering over every detail: the worn carpet runner, the portraits lining the walls, and the unmistakable faint scent of violets lingering in the air. At the end of the corridor, Mrs. Brightwell pushed open a heavy door and stood aside, clasping her hands nervously. Poirot stepped into the room, and I followed, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. Lady Eugenia lay upon a chaise longue, her hands folded upon her chest. The crimson veil shrouded her face, its rich fabric falling like a cascade of blood-red silk across her body. In the dim light, it gave the eerie impression that her face had bled away into nothingness. "Mon Dieu," Poirot said softly. "Such theatre." I swallowed hard. "You mean, you think this is staged?" "Mais oui," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It is too perfect, Hastings. A woman dies, veiled in scarlet, with her hands so neatly placed. This is not despair, it is design." On the side table lay a folded piece of paper. Poirot picked it up delicately, raising his brows. "A farewell note," he read aloud. "I can endure no more. The truth must be buried with me. There are things that should never be seen." "It sounds genuine," I said. Poirot shook his head. "Non. The tone. It is wrong. It is too vague, too general. When one writes a final confession, one is either specific or emotional. This is neither." He lifted the veil carefully, revealing Lady Eugenia's face. Serene, but strangely unfamiliar. Her features were delicate, but her left wrist bore a curious scar, half hidden by a bracelet. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Left-handed," he murmured. "And yet the wounds, they are made at an awkward angle, as though by a right-handed person." I blinked. "You mean?" Poirot raised a finger to his lips. "Patience, mon ami. The story, it is only beginning." We descended to the drawing room, where the household had assembled in uneasy silence. The air was thick with unspoken tension, like the hush before a storm. Poirot stood, hands clasped, his gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said softly, "allow me to express my condolences, but I must also express my duty. For the circumstances, they are most irregular." A tall, broad-shouldered man rose to his feet. "Captain Lionel Montclair," he said gruffly. "Lady Eugenia's stepson." Poirot gave a slight bow. "And you were present last night?" "Of course I was," he snapped. "I've been staying here for weeks, trying to untangle her cursed finances." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Finances. Toujours the finances." A slender woman in a dress several seasons out of fashion gave a theatrical sniff. "Arabella Thorne," she announced. "Distant cousin. I'd only just arrived yesterday afternoon. Terrible shock." "Ah," said Poirot. "Family, so complex, n'est-ce pas?" Beside her, a thin, fidgeting man adjusted his spectacles. "Dr. Godfrey Blaine," he said. "I've attended Lady Eugenia for years. This whole business of the veil and the mirrors. Sheer hysteria, if you ask me." Poirot's brow lifted. "And yet, Doctor, you did not prevent her death." The doctor flushed. "You must understand she was prone to moods, highly suggestible, especially after what?" I prompted. The doctor's mouth snapped shut. Poirot turned to Mrs. Brightwell, who stood silently, hands folded like a schoolgirl. "And you, madame?" "The housekeeper always sees everything." Mrs. Brightwell gave a nervous little shake of her head. I follow Lady Eugenia's orders. That's all. It's not my place to question." "But you do question, no?" Poirot's smile was small and knowing. "Because you live in a house that fears its own reflection." Mrs. Brightwell's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot settled into an armchair, steepling his fingers. And so, he said, the players take their places. But one must ask, who writes the script? Poirot sat beside the fire in Lady Eugenia's study, the so-called suicide note resting delicately between his fingertips. He had read it aloud twice already, once in his usual clipped fashion, and once with exaggerated theatricality, as if to test its sincerity through performance. I paced restlessly. It seems clear enough to me, Poirot, I said. A desperate woman, haunted by some family secret, takes her own life. That's what the note says. Poirot's moustaches gave a most eloquent twitch. Non, Hastings. You read the words, but you do not listen to them. He tapped the paper gently. It is too vague, mon ami, too detached. A woman who truly intends to end her life does not write with such polite detachment. There is no passion, no regret, only the cold suggestion of a hand attempting to sound tragic. But some people are less dramatic than others, I protested. Poirot's expression softened into that look of patient exasperation he reserved exclusively for me. Hastings, mon pauvre ami, even the most reserved Englishwoman does not write of her own death like she is drafting an invitation to tea. He placed the note beside a small blotter on the desk and turned the page sideways, holding it toward the light. Observe, there are faint indentations here, as if someone copied these words from another source. A previous letter, perhaps. Copied? But why would Lady Eugenia copy her own farewell note? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Why indeed? Unless, of course, she did not write it at all. The door creaked slightly, and Mrs. Brightwell hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. Is it not genuine, monsieur? That, madame, is the question. Poirot's gaze was suddenly sharp. Tell me, was there any other note, one not shown to the police? Mrs. Brightwell hesitated. There was a letter Lady Eugenia kept in her private drawer, one she wrote years ago to someone she called my mirror. But I never read it. Poirot's fingers drummed softly. Mon miroir, most curious. And you say this letter vanished? Yes, monsieur. The drawer was empty when I checked this morning. Poirot stood. Then we must find it, Hastings. For somewhere in this house, the truth has been copied. And the truth, it is rarely polite. Poirot stood before Lady Eugenia's dressing table, the crimson veil spread across the polished wood like a bloodstain that time had failed to cleanse. In the flickering lamplight, the veil shimmered faintly, its silk whispering secrets long buried. Hastings, Poirot said softly, what does a mourning veil do? I blinked at the odd question. Well, it hides a widow's grief, I suppose. It lets her keep her face hidden from prying eyes. Just so. Poirot lifted the fabric between thumb and forefinger. But this is no mourning veil. It is something quite different. The colour, so rich, so daring. And look here, along the edge, you see the delicate beading. This is not the work of a simple seamstress. It is the work of a costumière. A costume? I frowned. But why would Lady Eugenia own a masquerade veil? Poirot's smile was almost mischievous. Because it does not belong to Lady Eugenia. It belonged to her sister. I nearly dropped my teacup. Her sister? I didn't even know she had one. Nor did most people, Poirot said. A twin sister, mon ami. And this veil, this was worn at a ball long ago, when the two sisters were nearly indistinguishable. One small scar marked the difference between them. A scar the veil was designed to hide. I stared at him. But what happened to the sister? Poirot shrugged, though the gesture was deliberate. Some say she died. Others say she vanished. What matters is this. The veil belongs to the sister, and yet it was found on Lady Eugenia. Are you saying the woman we saw at the Ritz? Poirot's eyes sparkled. Ah, you begin to think at last. Oui, mon ami. The lady in the crimson veil was not Lady Eugenia, but the sister she lost. I sat down heavily. But if Lady Eugenia is dead and the sister has returned, what does that mean? Poirot smoothed the veil tenderly. "It means, Hastings, that this crime, if crime it is, began not last night, but decades ago. This is a case where the present is merely the reflection of a long-buried past." It was after dinner, and a heavy silence had settled over the house. The guests had retired to their various corners, Captain Montclair sulking by the fireplace, Miss Thorne nursing a brandy larger than her slender frame could handle, and Dr. Blaine muttering about the nervous strain of country living. Poirot and I had just seated ourselves in the drawing-room when the scream shattered the silence. It was high-pitched, unmistakably feminine, and seemed to bounce off the very walls. Poirot sprang to his feet with surprising agility, and I was half a step behind him as we hurried into the corridor. The sound had come from the small side parlour, a dim room with heavy curtains and the faint scent of lavender. Mrs. Brightwell stood trembling by the far wall, her hand pressed to her throat. "I saw it," she gasped. "I saw it with my own eyes." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "Calmez-vous, madame. What did you see?" She pointed a shaking finger to the mantelpiece, where a small silver tray sat, its surface polished to a dull shine. "My face," she whispered. "But not my face." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I felt the hair rise on my neck at her words. "The reflection," she said. "I saw my face, but beside it was another face, staring back at me. A woman, pale, her veil lifted, and then it vanished." Poirot stepped forward, examining the tray with interest. A house without mirrors, and yet nature is clever, is it not? A polished surface can act as a mirror if the light strikes just so. He turned to Mrs. Brightwell. "This face you saw, did you recognize it?" The housekeeper's lips trembled. It looked like Lady Eugenia, but I swear it was the sister, the one they say died long ago." Poirot's expression was unreadable. "Most curious," he murmured. "It seems, mon cher Hastings, that the past refuses to stay buried." I tried to laugh off the suggestion, but there was something about the house, about that reflection, that sent a chill straight through me. The morning after Lady Eugenia's death dawned grey and listless, as though the house itself had no desire to wake. Poirot, however, was in his most meticulous form, his moustaches groomed to needle-like precision, and his patent leather shoes gleaming even in the dull light. "The truth, Hastings," he announced as we descended to the drawing-room, "is not found in facts alone. No, facts can deceive. But the human face, the tremble of a hand, the careless word, these are the true fingerprints of guilt." I was still puzzling over this pronouncement when the first of the household guests appeared. Miss Arabella Thorne, swathed in a moth-eaten shawl, eyes red-rimmed and dramatic. "I suppose you'll want to question me," she said, with the tragic air of a woman who imagines herself at the centre of a romantic scandal. "Indeed, mademoiselle," said Poirot, ushering her to a chair. "But not about what you saw, about what you felt." She blinked. "Felt? I don't understand." "Precisely," said Poirot. "You did not understand Lady Eugenia, did you?" Arabella's mouth tightened. "She was strange. She never liked mirrors. Once, when I offered her my compact, she flung it across the room, said reflections were dangerous." "And you thought?" "I thought she was mad." Poirot's head tilted slightly, as though absorbing the vibration of a distant clue. He dismissed Arabella and called for Captain Montclair next. The captain stood stiffly, every inch the exasperated soldier. "Lady Eugenia, she was a troubled woman, no doubt," he said brusquely. "Always harping on about the past. Couldn't leave well enough alone. And the veil, did it mean nothing to you?" "Just another of her quirks," Montclair said. But Poirot's gaze flicked down, the captain's hand clenched tightly, white-knuckled, around the arm of the chair. "It is strange," Poirot murmured later as we climbed the stairs. "No one speaks of love. Always money or family name or fear. But love, Hastings, Where is it in this house? It was Mrs. Brightwell who provided the missing piece, though it took some gentle coaxing from Poirot. We found her in the linen room, folding sheets with unnecessary force, her face lined with tension. I have served Lady Eugenia for nearly 30 years, she said at last. I knew her before she married. I knew her when she had a sister. A sister, madame? Poirot's voice was soft, but his eyes sharpened. Mrs. Brightwell glanced over her shoulder as though afraid of being overheard. Her twin sister, Sylvia. They were inseparable as girls, but that changed. There was a ball, a masquerade, grand affair. Lady Sylvia wore the crimson veil. Lady Eugenia wore blue. And at this ball, Poirot prompted. Mrs. Brightwell hesitated, fingers worrying the edge of a pillowcase. There was a scandal. They say Lady Sylvia disappeared that night, ran away with some man. Others say... She stopped. Continue, Poirot encouraged. They say Lady Eugenia locked her sister away after a terrible quarrel. That Sylvia was never seen again. Hastings, ever the romantic, was horrified. Locked her away? But surely... Mrs. Brightwell shook her head. I don't know the truth, sir. All I know is, after that night, all the mirrors were covered. Lady Eugenia couldn't bear to see her own face. But why? I asked. Poirot's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on his knee. Ah, Hastings. Sometimes a face does not belong only to oneself. In a twin, it is shared. Perhaps, each time Lady Eugenia looked in the mirror, she saw not herself, but the sister she had lost. But if Sylvia disappeared, I said, how could she have written the letter? How could she have been at the Ritz? Poirot rose, his gaze distant, but alight with some inner certainty. That, mon ami, is the question we must answer. But remember this, when one twin disappears, the world assumes the other one remains. But what if... He broke off, shaking his head. You're being cryptic again, Poirot. Mais oui, it is my duty. Poirot's smile was fleeting. But remember, Hastings, when we know the story of the masquerade ball, we shall know the truth. The crimson veil lay spread out across Poirot's lap like a relic in a museum, as he sat in Lady Eugenia's private sitting room. His fingertips traced the delicate embroidery, the beadwork shimmering faintly in the afternoon light. Mon cher Hastings, Poirot began, his voice warm with satisfaction. Do you remember when we first saw this veil? At the Ritz. Of course, I said. It was worn by the veiled woman, the one who disappeared before we could speak to her. Just so, Poirot's eyes twinkled. But now, you see, we know this veil was not Lady Eugenia's at all. I frowned. But it was found on her body. Oui, but that is precisely why it is so important. It does not belong to Lady Eugenia. Poirot stood and held the veil up before the mirrorless wall. This, mon ami, was once worn by Lady Sylvia, the twin sister. I could not suppress my surprise. The sister who vanished after the masquerade ball? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Exactly. Lady Sylvia wore this very veil at the ball where everything began. It was no ordinary ball. It was a night where identities were masked and exchanged, where sisters became interchangeable. But why wear her sister's veil now? I asked, struggling to piece it together. Ah, Hastings, Poirot said, shaking a finger. That is the question you English ask when you think of clothes as mere garments. But to a woman, especially a woman of mystery, clothes are symbols. This veil does not hide a face, it hides a story. He let the veil drift onto the desk with a soft whisper. The woman in the Ritz was not Lady Eugenia. It was Lady Sylvia, returning at last from the past, and her presence set all of this in motion. Hastings stared. But if Lady Sylvia is alive, Poirot raised a hand. Patience, mon ami. That question we shall answer soon enough. The attic door creaked on its hinges, releasing a breath of cold air as though the house itself exhaled secrets long buried. Poirot led the way, his shoes tapping delicately against the worn wooden stairs. I followed, slightly less gracefully, coughing on the dust stirred into the air. Such places, Hastings, Poirot remarked. They are time capsules. Families lock away their past, out of sight, out of mind. But memory, mon ami, is not so easily dismissed. The attic itself was cluttered with trunks and discarded furniture, the air thick with the scent of old wood and mothballs. In the far corner, beneath a sheet of yellowed muslin, Poirot uncovered a portrait. It was a double portrait. Two young women, dressed identically in ball gowns, standing side by side. The resemblance was uncanny, except for one difference. Look closely, Hastings, Poirot instructed. I leaned in, and there it was, just visible beneath the choker around Lady Sylvia's neck. A scar, thin but unmistakable. The scar, Poirot murmured, a childhood injury, or perhaps the result of some sisterly quarrel, and you see how the artist has softened it, almost hiding it. But the sisters knew, and that is why the veil was made, to hide Sylvia's imperfection. I shook my head in wonder. They were practically identical. Identical, mon ami, except for that one mark. It is the simplest of disguises, and the most dangerous. For when one twin disappears, who is to say which one remains? Poirot replaced the portrait with care, his fingers briefly tracing the carved frame. The house remembers Hastings, and soon so shall we. We found Captain Lionel Montclair brooding by the library window, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He stood rigidly, his back to us, shoulders squared with the brittle defiance of a man who has built a wall between himself and the world. Captain, Poirot began smoothly. A moment, if you please. Montclair turned, jaw tight. More questions, is it? I've told you everything I know. Ah, Poirot said gently. But it is often not what one knows, but how one tells it. That interests Hercule Poirot. Montclair sighed and launched, unprompted, into a highly detailed account of his evening. Every minute accounted for, from the precise time he retired to the library, the exact number of cigars smoked, even the pages of his book, a naval memoir, he claimed to have read. It's all there, Montclair finished sharply. You can check with the others. Poirot steepled his fingers. You are, how shall I say, excessively clear, mon capitaine. It is rare, I find, that a man recalls the passage of time with such mechanical precision. Unless, of course, he has rehearsed the telling. Montclair's face darkened. Are you accusing me of lying? Not lying, perhaps, Poirot said mildly, but arranging. You have built yourself an alibi like a house of cards, monsieur. Too perfect, too tidy. He paused. And when the alibi is too perfect, it is because it is designed to be seen. Montclair's fingers twitched. I know my own movements, he muttered. Mais oui, Poirot agreed, but do you know the truth beneath them? With that cryptic remark, Poirot excused us, leaving Montclair scowling at his untouched drink. Outside, I whispered, you think he's hiding something? Not hiding, Hastings. Performing Poirot's eyes glittered. And a performance, mon ami, is always for an audience. That evening, the house stirred uneasily. Shadows seemed deeper, footsteps echoed louder, and the walls, if I may put it dramatically, seemed to breathe. Even I, a man not easily spooked, found myself starting at the creak of a floorboard. We found Mrs. Brightwell in the corridor, clutching her apron in both hands, her face as pale as chalk. I heard it again, she whispered. The crying. Crying, I echoed. She's here, the housekeeper said feverishly. Lady Sylvia. Her spirit walks the house. Nonsense, I said firmly, though my voice lacked conviction. Poirot was watching Mrs. Brightwell with interest, but not alarm. And this spirit, madam, he said softly, she weeps for what? For her death, Mrs. Brightwell breathed, or for her sister's sin. Before I could challenge this melodramatic nonsense, Dr. Blaine appeared, hands thrust into his pockets, expression severe. I see Mrs. Brightwell is spreading her tales again, the doctor said briskly. Superstition. nothing but the decaying mind of an overworked servant. And you, Dr. Blaine, Poirot said gently, you prefer a more scientific explanation? Certainly, Blaine said. The whole family is steeped in madness. Lady Eugenia suffered from delusions, and there's every reason to believe her sister, if she lives, is equally afflicted. Poirot's brow lifted. You are very certain, Doctor, and yet you have no records of this hereditary affliction. Blaine's mouth twisted into a smile. You don't need records when you see the signs. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. And yet, monsieur, you seem very determined to convince me of this theory, even without evidence. It's plain fact, Blaine insisted. Poirot smiled faintly. Or perhaps, it is convenient fact. We left the doctor fuming, and I shook my head. I suppose you suspect him too? Poirot shrugged. I suspect everyone, mon ami. That is the duty of the detective. But suspicion, it is like perfume in the air. It lingers longest around those who apply it most heavily. As we returned to our rooms, Mrs. Brightwell's trembling voice echoed in my mind. The crying, the footsteps, the mirrors that reflected nothing and everything. And yet, Poirot seemed untroubled, whistling a cheerful tune under his breath. Why so light-hearted? I demanded. Poirot smiled. Because, Hastings, when the house begins to lie, it is because the truth is getting too close. It was Miss Arabella Thorne who presented the letter, with the air of a woman producing a masterpiece of evidence. She perched on the very edge of her chair in the drawing-room, her fingers trembling as she held out a yellowed envelope. I didn't know if I ought to show this, she said, eyes darting between us, but I found it in Lady Eugenia's escritoire this morning. Poirot accepted the envelope with a delicate bow of the head, his fingertips barely brushing the paper. And you believe this to be? A love letter, Arabella said breathlessly, written by Lady Eugenia herself years ago. It's very romantic. Romantic? Poirot's brow lifted ever so slightly. We shall see. He removed the folded page within and scanned its contents, his expression utterly unreadable. I leaned forward, craning my neck, but Poirot held the letter at a precise angle, allowing me only a glimpse. My dearest, my only, Poirot read aloud, his voice inflected with exaggerated pathos. I have waited so long, longing for the day you would return. My heart aches when I think of all we lost. But if fate is kind, we shall meet again where the violets bloom. He folded the letter with great care, placing it back in its envelope before turning his gaze to Miss Thorne, who was practically vibrating with excitement. You are quite certain Lady Eugenia wrote this? Who else could it be? She demanded. It was in her desk, after all. Indeed, said Poirot. But you see, mademoiselle, there is a problem. What problem? She asked, her enthusiasm faltering. Poirot smiled faintly. The handwriting, it is, how shall I put it, too careful. The loops are hesitant, the letters formed with the deliberation of someone who wished to copy a hand, rather than write naturally. Miss Thorne's brow furrowed. But if it wasn't Lady Eugenia, who else could have written it? That, mademoiselle, is the question. Poirot tapped the envelope lightly. And the answer, I think, lies not in who wrote it, but in who was meant to find it. It was shortly after dinner when Poirot summoned the household to the grand drawing-room. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn shut, the chandelier blazing overhead, casting harsh shadows that trembled across the walls. There was something theatrical in the atmosphere, as though the house itself held its breath. I stood near the hearth, notebook in hand, feeling that familiar mixture of excitement and confusion that always came before one of Poirot's famous revelations. The suspects filed in, each with varying degrees of reluctance. Captain Montclair stood stiffly by the mantelpiece, arms folded across his chest like a man preparing for a firing squad. Miss Thorne fluttered into a chair, clutching a lace handkerchief to her bosom, while Mrs. Brightwell wrung her hands with a martyr's air. Dr. Blaine, leaning against a side table, adopted the smug detachment of a man who had already made up his mind that everyone but himself was mad. Poirot entered last, immaculate as always, his patent shoes gleaming, his hands neatly clasped. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began with a slight bow. "It is time." He paused, letting silence gather weight. A woman is dead. That is a tragedy. But more tragic still is the fact that the truth has been hidden beneath a veil, not of crimson silk, but of secrets. Miss Thorne gave a small gasp. Captain Montclair's jaw tightened. Poirot continued. "Tonight, I shall tell you the true story of Lady Eugenia Montclair, a story of love betrayed, of sisters torn apart, and of a masquerade ball whose echoes still haunt this house." He moved to the center of the room, like a conductor preparing his orchestra. "But first, you must understand one thing. This death, it is not as it seems. It is not the simple act of a desperate woman, but rather a murder in disguise." He paused once more, then smiled faintly. "Come, my friends, let us remove the veil together." Poirot took his position by the writing desk, where the suicide note still lay, a forlorn scrap of paper whose every word had been dissected and doubted. "Lady Eugenia," Poirot began, "was discovered with her wrists slashed, the crimson veil covering her face and a farewell note beside her. A most dramatic tableau, is it not?" Mrs. Brightwell made a small sound, half sob, half shudder. Poirot inclined his head sympathetically, then went on. "But, mes amis, there is a problem, the method of death." He raised his hand, miming the action of slicing one's wrist. Lady Eugenia was left-handed, and yet the wounds, they were made at an angle natural to a right-handed person. Does this not strike you as odd? I confess I had not thought of it, but as soon as Poirot said it, the flaw was glaringly obvious. "Good heavens," I exclaimed. "You're right." "Oui, mon ami," Poirot said, eyes gleaming. "A woman accustomed to using her left hand would have cut herself differently. But this is not all. Consider the suicide note itself." He picked up the note and held it aloft. "You will recall, Hastings, that the phrasing was peculiar, detached, almost rehearsed. And why? Because it was not written by Lady Eugenia at all. It was copied from a letter she had once written to her sister Sylvia many years ago." A collective murmur passed through the room. Poirot went on. "The purpose of this forgery was simple, to make us believe that Lady Eugenia had killed herself, haunted by the return of her sister. It was a story too perfect, as all lies must be." He crossed the room to Captain Montclair. "And who would have the greatest need for such a deception? Who would benefit most from Lady Eugenia's death being seen as suicide rather than murder?" Montclair's lips parted, but Poirot held up a hand. "Patience, mon capitaine. We shall come to that. For first we must understand this. The crimson veil belonged not to Lady Eugenia, but to Sylvia herself. And if that veil lay upon the body, it could mean only one thing. This was not a death of despair, but a crime of confusion." Poirot's gaze swept the room. Whoever killed Lady Eugenia believed they were killing Sylvia, and that, mes amis, is the key to the entire mystery. The room had grown heavy with tension, as Poirot carefully unfolded the suicide note once again, its edges worn with age and handling. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting a flickering light on the faces of the assembled suspects. They were all watching Poirot closely now, each waiting for his next move, but none of them quite knowing what he would say. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice cool and deliberate, "this note, which you have all assumed was written by Lady Eugenia, is not what it seems." A wave of confusion rippled through the room. Miss Thorne shifted in her seat, Captain Montclair's jaw clenched, and Dr. Blaine's eyes narrowed. But Poirot was unfazed, his eyes fixed on the note as he held it up for them to see. "This note," Poirot continued, "is not her handwriting. It is a copy of a letter Lady Eugenia wrote many years ago, to someone else entirely." The room fell silent. Mrs. Brightwell looked faintly bewildered. but the others were transfixed by Poirot's words. Poirot paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle in the air before he pressed on. I have examined this note carefully, and I am certain of its origin. The shape of the letters, the pressure of the ink, they are exactly the same as those in a letter written by Lady Eugenia to her twin sister, Sylvia, years ago. You see, it is the same words, the same message, but they have been carefully transcribed. The hand of the writer is not Lady Eugenia's, but someone else's entirely. He allowed the moment to sink in before addressing Captain Montclair, who had begun to breathe more heavily. Captain Montclair, Poirot said with a small smile, you know this, do you not? You are the one who copied the letter, the one who staged this suicide in order to frame Lady Eugenia for something she never did. Montclair's eyes flashed with anger, but Poirot was not yet finished. Why would you do such a thing, Captain? Poirot asked, his voice quiet and measured. To cover up your own guilt. You wanted everyone to believe that Lady Eugenia had taken her own life rather than expose the truth. The truth that you were responsible for her death, thinking her twin would never return. The mirror mystery had perplexed us all. This odd, almost obsessive avoidance of mirrors that Lady Eugenia had practiced throughout her life. It had been one of the first things that struck me as odd when I arrived at Ravenmore House, and it had weighed heavily on Poirot's mind as well. Now, as the room fell silent after Poirot's revelation about the forged suicide note, he turned to face the group once again, his expression calm but piercing. There was a certain finality to the moment as Poirot continued his explanation, his voice low but compelling. Mon ami, you must understand this, Poirot began, addressing the gathered guests. Lady Eugenia's fear of mirrors, it was not a matter of madness, as some of you have suggested. No, it was something much more complex. Lady Eugenia was afraid of what she would see in the mirror, but not because of any irrational fear. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. It was the fear of seeing her twin sister's reflection staring back at her. Lady Eugenia had been haunted by the image of her sister, Sylvia, for years. You see, she believed that if she looked into a mirror, she would see not her own face, but the face of Sylvia, who had been lost, or so everyone thought. The mirror was a portal to the past, and Lady Eugenia could not bear to face the truth of what had happened to her sister. I stood there, stunned by the clarity of it all. But the mirrors were removed, Poirot. They were covered, hidden. Ah, Hastings, that is the key, Poirot said, his eyes twinkling with understanding. For Lady Eugenia, the mirrors were more than mere reflections. They were symbols of guilt. Guilt for her twin's disappearance, guilt for the things that happened in the past. By removing the mirrors, she believed she could erase the reflection of her sister from her life. Erase the reflection, I repeated, still trying to make sense of it all. Yes, Poirot replied, his voice soft. But that was the tragedy. No mirror, no veil, no reflection could hide the truth. And that is why the crimson veil became so significant. It was not just an accessory. It was a shield against the truth. And when Lady Eugenia died, the truth of her sister's return could no longer be ignored. Poirot turned to the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled suspects. It was Lady Sylvia, the twin who disappeared, who had returned. And the crime that was committed was not the death of Lady Eugenia, but the sacrifice of a woman's own identity, hidden beneath the veil of fear and guilt. The grand drawing room was deathly still. The only sound was the occasional rustle of Poirot's carefully folded napkin, or the soft sigh of the fire crackling in the hearth. The suspects stood in their appointed places, eyes glued to Poirot, awaiting his next move. Poirot stepped forward, a slight smile tugging at his lips, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man who was about to deliver a truth so unbelievable, yet so logical, that none would be able to refute it. You see, Poirot said, his voice clear and precise, the mystery of the crimson veil is one not of death, but of identity. There was a collective intake of breath from the room. Who is the woman in the veil, you ask? Poirot continued, his eyes sweeping the room. It is not, as you believe, Lady Eugenia Montclair, but her twin sister, Sylvia. The woman who has been missing for years, thought to be dead. She is alive. I saw a flicker of disbelief cross Captain Montclair's face, but it was quickly masked by the carefully cultivated mask of a man who had nothing to hide. "But surely, Poirot, you are mistaken," said Dr. Blaine, his voice tight with tension. "Lady Sylvia was dead," Poirot finished for him. "That is the rumour, is it not? The mystery that has lingered like a shadow over this house. But no, mon ami, she is not dead." Miss Thorne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But how could this be? How could Sylvia be here, in this house?" Poirot's smile widened. "Because she has been here all along, right under your noses. The woman you saw at the Ritz, the one who wore the crimson veil, was not Lady Eugenia at all. It was Sylvia Montclair." "But why the veil?" I asked, finally speaking up, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in my mind. Poirot turned toward me, his eyes glinting with that familiar, knowing gleam. "The veil, Hastings, was the key to hiding Sylvia's identity. It allowed her to walk among you without being recognized. But it also had another purpose. You see, the veil was a symbol of the past, of the sisterly bond, and of the guilt that Lady Eugenia felt for the disappearance of her twin." Poirot's words hung in the air, leaving the room in stunned silence. The woman in the veil, the one who had caused all this upheaval, had not died in some tragic accident. She had returned silently, an act of reckoning long overdue. The room was charged with tension as Poirot turned his piercing gaze towards Captain Lionel Montclair. He seemed utterly composed, but I noticed the slight twitch of his fingers, his jaw tight, and his gaze darting away from Poirot's gaze. The captain's physical reactions betrayed him far more than he realized. Poirot took a deliberate step forward. "Ah, mon capitaine, you believe you have been clever, do you not? But you are not as clever as you think. You killed Lady Eugenia, but not out of any hatred towards her. No, you killed her because you believed she was Lady Sylvia." A murmur ran through the room, but Poirot held up a hand, silencing them. "The plan was simple, yet brilliant in its deceit. You had spent years covering up your financial misdeeds, embezzling from the family fortune. You had built a life based on lies, and when you thought Sylvia Montclair had returned, you feared she would expose everything." Montclair opened his mouth, but Poirot pressed on. "You knew that Sylvia's return meant discovery. You knew she would uncover your crimes, your embezzlement, the money you had stolen. So you made a choice to kill the woman you thought was Sylvia, believing her to be the threat. And in your blind panic, you staged the suicide, hoping to cover up the murder." "But why the veil?" Montclair spat, his voice shaking with rage. Poirot smiled slightly. "Ah, the veil. The crimson veil was a symbol of family secrets, of guilt. It was not just worn by Lady Eugenia to hide her face from the world. It was used by you, Captain Montclair, to confuse the identity of the woman you killed." Montclair's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "It wasn't supposed to end this way. I thought I had covered my tracks perfectly." Poirot's smile faded. "But you see, Captain, you underestimated the power of the truth. The truth cannot be buried forever. Lady Sylvia's return was inevitable, and no matter how many mirrors you broke, no matter how many secrets you tried to erase, the past always catches up." I watched as Montclair's face twisted in realization, and for the first time, I saw true fear in his eyes. Poirot turned to address the entire room. "And now the truth is known. Lady Eugenia was not the victim, as you all thought. She was the unwitting casualty of a plan set into motion years ago by a man terrified of being exposed. The real victim, the real tragedy, is not the death of Lady Eugenia, but the life of a man whose guilt has weighed upon him for far too long." Montclair slumped forward in his chair, his face pale with shame. What have I done?" he muttered, his voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting myself." Poirot's voice was firm. You were protecting nothing, Captain. You were only protecting a lie that could never last. The truth, mon ami, always finds a way. The room fell quiet as Poirot stepped forward, his eyes piercing through the gloom of the grand drawing room, locking onto Captain Lionel Montclair. The air seemed to thicken with every word Poirot spoke, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to hear the truth that was about to be uncovered. Mon ami, Poirot began, his voice steady. You sit there, but I see clearly that you are a man trapped by his own fears, by the weight of sins long buried. Fear is what drives men to commit unspeakable acts. I could see Montclair's face flush as Poirot's words hit home. The captain shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes darting away from the group. But Poirot was relentless. He moved closer, circling the man like a hawk that had spotted its prey. You see, Captain, it was not hatred that drove you to kill Lady Eugenia. No, it was the fear of losing everything you had built, the fear of the past catching up with you, a fear that came from two sources. Montclair's hands clenched, and I could see him fighting to maintain his composure. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. Poirot smiled faintly. Oh, but you do. You see, my dear Montclair, there were two things that terrified you. First, the affair you once had with Lady Sylvia. The affair that, if discovered, would have destroyed everything. And second, your embezzlement from the estate. The money you stole, hoping no one would notice, was the key to your downfall. Montclair's eyes widened. You're mad. I didn't. But you did, Poirot interjected sharply, his voice firm. You feared that Lady Sylvia's return would expose your affair, the love affair that you never intended to be discovered. When you saw Sylvia again, alive, returning to the house, you realized that your secrets were on the verge of being exposed. I saw Montclair's breath quicken. You see, Poirot continued, you believed that if Lady Sylvia returned, she would reveal not only your financial crimes, but also your affair, the one you had tried so hard to keep hidden. You feared that Lady Sylvia, with her knowledge of the truth, would take everything from you. The captain's fists tightened again, and he lowered his head. His lips parted, but he said nothing. Poirot's gaze softened, just slightly. You knew that Lady Eugenia could not understand the depth of your guilt. You also knew that she was too bound by her own grief and guilt to challenge you. So you killed her, believing her to be Lady Sylvia, the woman who threatened to undo everything you had worked so hard to hide. You don't understand, Montclair finally shouted, his voice breaking. I couldn't let it all come out. I was losing everything. If Sylvia had returned, it would have been the end of me. Poirot nodded slowly, acknowledging the captain's confession in his own quiet way. Ah, yes. You see, fear of the past can drive a man to do terrible things. But in your haste to protect yourself, you have only exposed yourself further. And now, mon ami, the truth is clear. Montclair sank into his chair, his face a mixture of defeat and resignation. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never meant for any of this to happen. Poirot stepped back, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle. He looked at the others, then back to Montclair. Yes, but the past always catches up with you, Captain. The lies cannot last forever. And now, the truth is out, for all to see. The room was heavy with tension, a stillness that seemed to press against us from every direction. Poirot stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes never leaving Captain Lionel Montclair, who sat with his back rigid, his hands clenched into fists. His usual arrogance had crumbled, replaced by an air of defeat. Mon capitaine, Poirot's voice cut through the silence. You are a man accustomed to control, yes. A man who has hidden his true self behind a mask of respectability. Montclair's jaw twitched, but he said nothing. His eyes were narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. He sat motionless, as though he were waiting for the inevitable blow. Poirot's expression remained serene, almost sympathetic. But, as I said earlier, the truth is relentless. You have hidden your guilt for far too long, and now it is time for you to confess. I watched as Montclair shifted in his chair, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Confess? He repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. I have nothing to confess. Poirot smiled faintly, taking a step closer. Ah, but you do. You killed Lady Eugenia, believing her to be Lady Sylvia. At this, Montclair's eyes flashed. No, do not interrupt me, Poirot said, raising a hand. You believed that Lady Sylvia had returned, and in your terror of the past being exposed, your affair with her, your embezzlement from the estate, you chose to take Lady Eugenia's life, thinking her to be her sister. Montclair stood suddenly, knocking his chair over. That is not true. His voice was ragged, desperate. I didn't. You did, Poirot pressed, his voice soft but insistent. You took her life to protect yourself, to protect the secrets you thought would ruin you. But fear is never a good motivator, is it? Fear only leads to mistakes. Montclair collapsed back into his chair, his face crumpling as the weight of Poirot's words finally broke through. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said hoarsely. I thought if I could just hide the truth, everything would be fine. Poirot's gaze softened, just slightly. That is always the way, mon ami. The lies grow heavier with time, until they crush the man who told them. Montclair's shoulders sagged, and he looked up at Poirot, his face pale with shame. I thought I had no choice, he whispered. Poirot leaned forward, his voice quiet, but resolute. You always had a choice, but you chose the easy way, and now you must face the consequences. Lady Sylvia Montclair had remained silent through the entire exchange, her eyes never leaving her brother, the man she once loved and trusted. Now, as the confession rang out and the room settled into its grim reality, she rose slowly from her chair, her movements steady, yet burdened by the knowledge of everything that had transpired. I never meant for this to happen, she said, her voice soft but firm. I only returned because I thought I could finally make amends. I never imagined my presence here would cause such a chain of tragic events. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his expression sympathetic. You returned for reconciliation, mon ami. You wished only to mend the wounds between you and your sister. Sylvia glanced at the empty chair where Lady Eugenia had once sat, the room suddenly feeling emptier, as if her sister's spirit still lingered within its walls. I thought I could face her, she said, her voice catching. I thought that if we could just speak again, we could put the past behind us. I never suspected my return would set off such a tragedy. I understand, Poirot said gently. But you see, your return was a shock to Captain Montclair. He believed his secrets would be exposed, and in his fear, he made a choice he could never take back. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she stood tall. I was never part of that world of deceit. I had no idea what my brother was capable of. But now, I must face the consequences of all that was hidden. Poirot gave a small nod, his expression both respectful and resolute. The truth, Lady Sylvia, has a way of emerging when it is least expected. And now, the burden of the past can be lifted, for both you and your sister. Sylvia wiped her eyes, her voice steady now. I only wanted peace, but I suppose peace can only come through the truth. I sat across from Poirot, watching him carefully as he sifted through the papers scattered on the table. My mind was still grappling with the mysteries of the past few days, the murder, the identity of Lady Sylvia, the crimson veil. But there was one thing that I could not quite understand. Poirot, I began, still feeling rather confused. There's something I don't quite grasp. The mirrors, the superstition. I can't make sense of why Lady Eugenia would be so terrified of them. Poirot's keen eyes turned toward me, his face serene but laced with amusement. Ah, Hastings, you are a man of logic, but sometimes it is not logic that holds the key. It is emotion. But it's the mirrors, Poirot. Why remove them all? Poirot set down the papers and leaned forward, his voice soft but full of meaning. Mon ami, Lady Eugenia did not fear the mirror itself. No, it was not the reflection that terrified her. It was the image of the past. The past was something she could never escape. Every time she looked into the mirror, she was forced to confront the face of her sister, the face of Sylvia, whom she had lost and whom she felt responsible for. I stared at Poirot, his words finally starting to unravel the mystery. So, she wasn't afraid of the mirrors, Poirot. She was afraid of what they revealed, her guilt. Exactly, Hastings. A woman in fear hides her face, but a woman in shame hides her past. I paused, the weight of his words sinking in. And that's why Sylvia returned, because she was the key to unlocking the past. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Ah, mon ami, you are beginning to understand. Poirot's explanation was elegant in its simplicity, yet it struck me with the force of a revelation. He leaned back, hands clasped, his gaze turning inward, as if he were gathering his thoughts before explaining the final piece of the puzzle. Now, you see, Hastings, the difference is this, Poirot said slowly. When a woman hides her face, it is because she is afraid. Fear of what others may think, fear of being exposed, fear of recognizing the truth within herself. But shame, Hastings, shame is something else entirely. A woman in shame does not hide her face, she hides her past. She hides the things she cannot change, the things she cannot erase, no matter how many mirrors she breaks or veils she wears. He looked at me then, his gaze piercing, as though he were peering straight through the very heart of the mystery. Lady Eugenia, you see, feared nothing more than seeing Sylvia's reflection in the mirror. For Sylvia was the key to everything, to the past she had tried to bury, to the guilt she had tried to escape. I leaned back, digesting this. So, Lady Eugenia wasn't really mad at all. She was simply running from the truth, from her own guilt. Poirot nodded. Exactly. And in doing so, she condemned herself to a life of fear and denial, and ultimately, to her death. As the night wore on, and the mystery drew to its inevitable close, there was one last twist in the tale. A letter, long hidden, arrived unexpectedly. It was addressed to Lady Eugenia from herself, written many years ago. Poirot examined the letter carefully, his face serene, yet somehow tinged with satisfaction. Ah, Hastings, he said, holding the letter aloft. Here is the final piece of the puzzle, written long before any of us arrived at Ravenmoor. It was a warning of sorts, one that Lady Eugenia had sent to herself, even before Sylvia's return. I glanced at the letter, intrigued. Poirot read aloud from the faded page. The past will return, like a shadow, and when it does, it will wear crimson. Beware, for when the time comes, the face of the past will be more than a memory. It will be a living truth. Poirot looked up at me with a knowing smile. Crimson, Hastings, the veil, the symbol of the past. Sylvia. I smiled wryly. It seems fate had its own plans for Lady Eugenia. Poirot's smile deepened. Indeed, my friend, the truth is often more poetic than we could ever imagine. And with that, Poirot turned, offering a final word of contentment and closure. The case is solved, Hastings. The veil has been lifted, and the past is finally allowed to rest. As we come to the end of another gripping case, we see once again that the truth, no matter how carefully concealed, always finds a way to emerge. Hercule Poirot, with his meticulous attention to detail, has once again demonstrated that it is not the facts that mislead us, but our own biases and fears. Whether it's a woman hiding her face, a long-buried secret, or the fear of the past catching up, Poirot has shown us that, in the end, the truth will always come to light. And as for Captain Montclair, well, as Poirot so often reminds me, no one escapes the consequences of their actions forever. But Hastings, still ever the skeptic, gives us his final word. You know, Poirot, I'm beginning to think that next time I'll take up a hobby other than getting involved in murderous schemes. Perhaps knitting. At least with yarn, the only thing that gets tangled is the thread. Now, over to you, dear viewers. What do you think was the biggest clue that exposed the murderer? Was it the crimson veil, or perhaps the mirror mystery? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more detective stories to life every day. And rest assured, more thrilling Poirot mysteries are on the way. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your wits sharp. The truth is always out there.